Yeah, so this morning we're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes. So if you want to find there is a book in the Bible called Ecclesiastes, in case you didn't know. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Desiree, if you'll go to the sermon notes tab on your left side, you'll see the first slide, which I've titled this message this morning, A Time for Change. And that's what I want to speak on today, a time for change. Truth be told, though, most of us, we don't like change that much. I, myself, don't like change. I like things the way they are. I like to have a flow and a consistency and a routine. But the reality is that change can be a good thing. As we look this morning in Ecclesiastes, in the first two chapters, the preacher or the writer is basically exhorting his readers to understand that each day is a gift from God. So if we were going to sum up chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Ecclesiastes, we would say that the point is that every day that we have is a gift of God. And then here in chapter 3, the writer begins to explain why each day is a gift from God. So what I want to do is I want to read the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Has everybody found it yet? If not, it will be on the screen this morning. And this is what the Word of God says. For everything there is a season and a time, and for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. In other words, the writer tells us that we should accept every day as a gift of God because God has a reason and a time for everything. He says, for everything, there's a season and a time. For every matter under heaven. And then following that, the writer gives us 14 pairs of examples of how life is comprised of these various seasons. And in this passage, I think there are several things that we could learn from today. So I want to give us 3 simple things I think that are applicable for us as a church family. Number 1, God is the one who appoints times and seasons, right? We've already established that there's a time for everything under the sun, right? That we went through this list of 14 things. But the reality is that God is the one who is in control of appointing these times and seasons, right? In this verse 1, it's for every person, in every place, in every circumstance. God has appointed the times and the seasons, right? The events of our lives. The happy and the sad. The easy and the difficult. And on the one hand, this can be worrisome because you realize that there are seasons in our lives. And there are changes that are going to come. But we don't know exactly when they are going to come. But God knows, right? And that could be worrisome in some ways. But on the other hand, that should be comforting to us. Because we know that God is the one who is in control of the times and the seasons of our lives. Right? Sometimes you may be tempted to think that God is not in control. Especially when you look around at the world around us right now. You know, everything that's going on. Crime, homelessness in our city, this pandemic, and you name it. But the truth is that God is in control and he has everything under his control. Whether we're able to see it, God has a purpose in everything that he does. Even if we have a hard time understanding what that purpose is. I love what Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says. It says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. The first thing we need to understand this morning is that God is the one who appoints the times and the seasons of our lives. He is in control of all of that. Number two, we live in a world of change. Right? That's not like groundbreaking news, right? We know this, that the evidence of change is all around us, right? The seasons change from, well, not so much in San Francisco, but in other parts of the world, the seasons change from winter to summer to fall to spring, right? Every year you get a couple more gray hairs on your head. Every year your body gets just a little bit weaker and more frail. It's just a part of life, right? Change. But change is good, because change does a couple of things. Change helps us not to become complacent in our spiritual life. A lot of times we can get to a point in our spiritual journey where we just do the same old thing over and over and over, and before long it becomes just a routine, a chore, just something we do all the time because we've been doing it for this amount of years, right? But change can help us overcome that complacency in our spiritual life. Change, it challenges us to think outside the box. It challenges us to dig deep into God's word and to find a solution for this new change. Another way that change is good is that it helps us to learn to adapt to new situations. We've already said that change is inevitable, right? And part of going through this process of change, we learn to adapt and we learn to grow, right? We get right or we get left, right? You learn to adapt or you get left behind. Technology is a great example of this, right? Technology, especially in the last 20 years, is just going crazy. And you bought a computer this year, next year it's going to be out of date. The technology is rapidly changing, so we have to, if we work in the fields where we need to work with technology, we have to continue to learn and adapt to this new technology. Change, it stretches you, and it challenges you to grow through the trials and the struggles of your life, right? But more than that, change is central to who we are as Christians. Because I'm going to tell you right now, if a change has not taken place in your life, you ought to be worried. Because listen, before you knew Jesus, you were lost. But now you are found, right? You were blind, but now you can see. You were dead, but now you are alive. Change is an essential part of the process of becoming a Christian, right? That hopefully you look up and some days after you put your faith in Jesus, you realize you're not the same person that you used to be. That there has been a significant change in your life, that the desires of your heart, your actions, all of these things begin to change and be conformed to the image of Christ. And as you grow as a Christian, you change, right? And the more you get to know God, the more you're aware of your sinfulness. And that drives you to want to change, right? You don't want to sin anymore. You don't want to be that person that you used to be. And through this process, God continues to change our hearts to be like His. Ask yourself this: are you the same person that you were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, last year? And we evolve and change as people, especially people of Jesus, as we encounter Him on a daily basis in a fruitful relationship. But during the process of change, it's tough, is it not? Especially for those of us who don't like change. It's tough. When we look back at our lives and we see the benefits of change, I remember, I don't have to remember too far, the ministry that I was in before I came here, we had a director, and he really wanted Tiffany and I to come and be a part of their ministry. And soon after we got to San Francisco, that director moved from San Francisco down to Memphis, where actually I'm from, and we got a new director. And his vision for this ministry did not necessarily include Tiff and I and our responsibilities. And so, he kind of he relayed that message to us. Hey, we have a direction for this ministry, and the type of ministry that you're doing is not included in that direction. And in that moment, it was difficult for me to comprehend, because I felt like, in my flesh that yeah, you do need me, or I don't. I come all the way out here and now I don't have a job, but then God led us to this ministry and this church. And looking back, man, God provided something so much better and so much greater for our lives, right? And through the process of change, sometimes it's difficult to see the positives. But when you look back on your life, right, you look back on the person you were 20 years ago, and you see, man, I am so glad I'm not that person anymore. And we see that change is good for us, right? Change is a crucial part of our lives, especially as Christians. So God is the one who appoints times and seasons. Number 2, we live in a world of change. Number 3, we need to be able to discern when a season has ended and when a new one has begun. That's what is implied in this passage, right? We talk about the fact that change, there's a season and a time for everything. And we said that God's in charge of that. And since there are seasons in our lives, we have to be able to discern, when we are in this season and when the next season is coming. Right? If it's true that everything in our lives has a season and time, and if change is inevitable in our lives, we need to be able to see when things are changing and to listen to God's voice and to make that change. But how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, we need to be walking by the Spirit. In fact, if you remember back several weeks ago in Ephesians, we had a whole couple of weeks on this idea of living by the Spirit, right? That the Spirit plays a huge role in our life and guides us and teaches us and encourages us and gives us the spirit of discernment. Right? The Spirit speaks into our lives. Did you know that discernment is a gift of the Spirit that we can have, right? Because the Spirit lives inside of us. And so if we want to be able to discern what is right and what is wrong, we have to live by the Spirit. In order to do that, we have to be focused on God and what He has for our lives. We have to have this vibrant, growing relationship where we're focusing on Him. And as we do that, the Spirit will reveal to us when the change is coming. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Familiar passage. It says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Paul is saying, listen, don't be conformed to the ways of this world anymore, but be transformed in your mind. Have a renewal of your mind. And if you do this, then you will be able to discern what is the will of God in your life. So in order to be able to discern these changes, you have to have a renewal of your mind, right? Not to live in the patterns of this world, but to be transformed by the Spirit of God. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. His divine power has granted us all things that pertain to life and godliness. Now we have everything that we need that pertain to life and godliness. However, the only way that we can take hold of this gift of discernment that the Spirit can give to us is to live by the Spirit. Right? We can't live lives throughout the week that are so distant from God and then come to church on Sunday and spend 1 hour a day and then expect the Spirit to be open and leading us, right? We have to live each moment by the Spirit, and as we do that, the Spirit will teach us and lead us and guide us. And I love in verse 11, we didn't read it, but verse 11 here in chapter 3 says this: He has made everything beautiful in its time. Think about that. He's talking about this passage, about how There's a time and a season for everything. That God's in control of it. Then he says that he, God, has made everything beautiful in its time. Listen, God's timing is always on time. It is perfect and it's beautiful. And we look back at our lives, even the disastrous parts of our lives, we can see God's hand at work in our lives, and it's beautiful, right? It's beautiful. Some of you may or may not remember, but back in August, I went to Kansas City. This is a time when COVID restrictions were kind of loosening up. And so the North American Mission Board was putting on this conference. And the conference was entitled, Am I a Replanter? And so it was intriguing to me. So actually, a church in Texas actually paid for me to go out there and to learn and to have this conference. So I went to Kansas City, and I spent some time here at this conference. If you don't know much about the North American Mission Board, it's an entity of the Southern Baptist Convention. We give to it every year, right, through the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. No, the annual Armstrong Easter offering. I get them mixed up. And they have their mission is to bring the gospel to North America. And they do this primarily through two ways. They have two focuses, if you will. The first one is church planting, starting new churches, right? The second one is church replanting. And that's, helping churches that are kind of older, that have lost its fervency for the gospel, who need some help, who are struggling, to help them to regain this new life. And so as I went to this conference there in Kansas City, that was my goal, is to learn some things for our church that could help us to bring new life to our church. But I went to this conference, and it was an incredible time of learning for me. And there's two things that I learned from this conference. The first one is that Balboa Baptist Church needs to be replanted. There needs to be a restart, a recharge, if you will, to breathe new life and newness into this church. And the second thing that I learned was that God has not called me to be a replanter. God has not called me, at least at this time in my ministry, to be, I don't have the skills, if you will, to take a church and replant it, restart it. So that said, Tiffany and I have been praying and seeking the Lord on what we should do. And trust me, a lot of prayer and a lot of seeking wisdom from others, a lot of tears, a lot of sadness has taken place in our lives in the past couple of months. And two things that I believe that God has confirmed in our spirits is that there's a time for change. There's a time for change at Balboa Baptist Church, and there's a time for change in the Davis family. So I want to talk about those two things really quickly. A time for a change in the Davis family. We believe that God is calling us away from this ministry and into a new season of ministry. And so I want to start by saying that we absolutely love this church. We love everything about this church. And over the last 4 years that we've been here, you guys have shown us so much love and so much grace. And we literally consider you guys as family of ours. And that's how much we care for you, right? It's difficult for us because we love you, we love this church, we love this community, we love this city. 7 years ago when we moved to San Francisco from Mississippi, we could have never imagined how much we could love San Francisco and this place. Right? In many ways, San Francisco is home for us. We've had a lot of firsts in this city. Tiffany and I have literally grown up in San Francisco. We've had all three of our kids in San Francisco. We went to seminary here. We planted roots in this city. And we have made so many memories that we'll cherish for the rest of our lives. And we hope and pray that God will call us back to this city. So one of the reasons why I wanted you to come here today is to let you know in person that we believe that God is calling us away from San Francisco. And so I want today to let you know that we are officially resigning as pastor of Balboa Baptist Church. So with that said, on January 26th, we're going to be moving to Columbia Falls, Montana. And we're going to begin a new ministry there. In Columbia Falls, Montana, there's a church called Gateway Church. Gateway Church was planted in Columbia Falls about 4 years ago, actually by one of my roommates in college and another guy that I know pretty well. And they have a vision of planting churches across the Pacific Northwest. And their vision is to plant 10 churches in the next 10 years. And so they've been asking Tiffany and I to pray for a year about this. And, the timing, we just didn't feel like it was right at that time. But the Lord just kept bringing this idea of church planting to our hearts. And we feel like that God is calling us into this season. And so we're going to go to Montana for 18 months. And we're going to learn through their church planting residency program how to plant churches. We're going to train and we're going to be sent out. And our goal is that at the end of 18 months that we will be equipped and ready, have a team structured around us, a team of leaders that we can be sent out to a new location where our churches are lacking and plant a new church in the community there. And so I wanted to let you know about that in person. I didn't want to do it in a video. So which is the main reason why I brought you here this morning. But listen, we believe that God is in this and that God is leading us to this, make this decision. And trust me, it's been a difficult one for our family. This is home. But we also know that we have to be obedient and be able to discern the change that God is bringing in our hearts and our minds. So that's the change that is going on in our family. The second part that I want to share this morning is that I believe that there needs to be a change at Balboa Baptist Church. And I want to share a couple of reasons why. Here's what I believe is the harsh reality for Balboa Baptist Church. If change does not take place, and take place quickly, Balboa Baptist Church will cease to exist. This church will die. I believe that. Because the reality is that our members are getting older, right? We're not reaching new people. And eventually, if these two things keep going together, right? Members getting older, not reaching new people, there won't be anybody left here at Balboa Baptist Church. So what needs to happen is there needs to be a restart, a reboot of our thinking, right? I like what the passage says. There's a time to break down and a time to build up. We need to have a time of breaking down the ways that we're doing things here and building them back up so they'll be stronger and more effective for the gospel. The first thing that we have to realize this morning, every one of us, is that Balboa Baptist Church is not our church. It's not my church. It's not your church. Balboa Baptist Church is God's church. And God put it here in this city, in this season, for his appointment. The church at large, I'm not talking about just Balboa Baptist, I'm talking about the church, is losing its foothold in this city. When I first came here, I was working for the association, and there was churches closing left and right. People coming here to start new churches and leaving because it's difficult in this city. More and more churches are closing. Buildings are being sold, and the presence of the gospel is fading away from the community. But I believe that's not God's will. And that's not God's will for this building, for this church, this community that we have around it. We have a foothold here in this community. Balboa Baptist Church has a foothold here. And I believe that God can do something great. So I've been praying and seeking counsel about what should we do? What should Balboa Baptist Church do? And I want to make a couple of recommendations to Balboa Baptist Church this morning. This is what I believe that what we should do as a church, and this is what I want to recommend that you do. Now, obviously, the decision is up to yours. This is, it's a collective body. But this church needs to be replanted. Balboa Baptist Church was planted January 26, 1957. And when it was planted, it was originally planted as Onondaga Baptist Church. 60 plus years this church has been in this community. And I know without a shadow of a doubt, God has done some amazing things in this church. And there's a lot of things to be celebrated. But as our text for today says, there's a time for everything. And I believe, and I want to recommend this morning, there's a time, that the time is now for Balboa Baptist Church to be replanted. So here's what that would look like. If Balboa decides, we want to go down this road of replanting, this is what it looks like. We'd have a meeting with Howard Burkhart. Howard Burkhart lives in Vallejo. He is the North American Mission Board's replanting strategist for the Northern California area. We'll have a meeting with him. And in this meeting, Howard will lay out, there's basically 4 options for this church going forward as it pertains to replanting. And he would share about those 4 options. And of course, the church would pray over and consider those 4 options. And he will share about the resources, right? One of the great things about the North American Mission Board is that it is designed to be a resource for the local church. And so they have resources that we don't necessarily have. He would lay out the resources that NAM can offer. And then from there, the church can make a decision on where they want to go. And they'll form a team around these goals. And as you know, this will be a process. And so I think a lot of you guys know David Parrish. David has come here quite a few times when I've been out to kind of fill in the preacher meeting. David is actually working closely with Howard Burkhart and advising churches through this replanting process. In fact, right now there's a church in Nevada that's going through a similar situation where they're looking to restart, to breathe new life back into their church. And David is kind of as their advisor, advising them and helping them navigate through this process. And I've talked with David, and I've asked him to pray about, consider maybe being that for Balboa Baptist Church. And obviously the decision is up to you. But I think David, under the right circumstances, is open to kind of being the interim if the church decides to go through this replanting process to kind of help guide through these steps. From when I leave until the replanting team comes in and helps restart this church. One of the ways that NAM they do replanting is they actually bring a team of trained leaders to a church and help them walk through this process together. And so David can be a part of that. And I believe that he's a great candidate to be an interim because obviously he's been working closely with replanting with Howard Burkhart, but also because he's someone that all of you guys know and trust, and he's a respectable person. David is an accountant of several churches in the Bay Area, so he has that knowledge of accounting and can help with the intricacies of what it looks like in reestablishing ourselves, our foothold in the community. So I want to make these recommendations. I called you here this morning basically for these 2 reasons, to let you know that we believe that God is calling us away from San Francisco to a new ministry. And then secondly, I believe that a replant is what really needs to happen here at this church. And hopefully you know that that over the 4 years that I've been here, that I have nothing but love for you. And this is my sincerest recommendation after having been here for 4 years, observing the community of this church, trying my best to breathe life into the church. I believe this is the best logical step for Balboa Baptist Church if it's going to continue to minister in this city. So this is what I want you to know about this morning. So some next steps for us is, I think that the church needs to make a decision on whether or not they want to go down this road of replanting. At least have the conversation. And so maybe have a vote and say, yes, I think that this is a good idea, and no, I think it's a horrible idea. Have that vote, and if the church decides to go down this road, then we can schedule a meeting. And if you decide quick enough, I could be a part of this meeting with you, with Howard and me and anyone in the church who wants to come and be a part of this and hear and learn about the resources that can be available for us.